Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final day of the 2016 Hack Summit. We have an incredible day for you today with some top speakers from around the world who are joining us. And we're joined now live from Spain, David Heinemeier Hansson, the creator of Ruby on Rails and a partner at Basecamp, which was formerly known as 37 Signals. David is the author of Getting Real, Rework, and Remote, and he designed the first version of the Basecamp SaaS platform. He's recognized by Google and O'Reilly as a Hacker of the Year, accepted a Jolt Award for product excellence, and also, and this is the coolest thing, does race car driving in his spare time and won his class in both Le Mans and the World Endurance Championship. David, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for taking the time and making a stand for these coding nonprofits with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So we're going to be doing a fireside chat here with David. So feel free to ask questions in the user interface as we chat. And David, if there's questions you want to ask back to the audience, like if you want to find out about our audience or have curious questions for them, we can make this interactive back to them again and have polls that go to them. So something to think about as we chat.
Yep.
So let's kick things off by just with a warm up. Just, one of the things I've noticed about you and your writings is that you seem to have a really deep love for programming. And I'm kind of curious about what you love about programming so much and what got you into programming in the first place.
Sure. So I got into programming because I needed programs. I wanted programs. I wanted to work with the web. I wanted to publish on the web. I started building a variety of gaming websites in Denmark and just found it easier when I could do things myself. I hate having to, I don't know, this sounds weird, but be dependent on other people to make the things I want happen. At least exploring the ideas that I have. I love to work with the tools myself. So that's how I sort of got into programming, but that was more from a utilitarian perspective. It wasn't so much, oh, I love to be a programmer or I love programming. It was more just a sense that like I needed some programs. And it actually took several years of doing that kind of programming before I started considering myself a programmer. And to be honest, it wasn't until I got to Ruby and Rails before I really fell in love with programming, before I really started thinking, oh, programming is something that I could do, not just because I need programs, of course, well, that's still an important driver, but also just because I like it inherently, that the act of programming is such a rush, such a expression of intellectual exploration, right? That you can take something from nothing and make things. I mean, isn't that amazing? Like you type stuff into a text editor and then through sort of the magic of the programming language, boom, you have programs that can do all sorts of amazing things. It's just, there's not a whole lot of endeavors like that that had that sense of craftsmanship without needing anything else but your computer and your brain. So the tip-over point for me really was discovering Ruby, just because the programming languages and environments I've been using prior to that, to me, were on that utilitarian basis. I'd been doing a lot of PHP, I'd been doing ASP, I'd been doing Java and JavaScript, and all those things. I mean, while there were glimmers of, hey, this is cool, this is fun, there was never this sustained notion of like, shit, my programming language understands me. Like it wants me to be happy. It's this direct connection between my brain and the interface. And that was really the discovery of Ruby, where it just went like, oh my God, like this is programming. This is a different kind, which is an interesting, and I get how that sounds perhaps like overly joyous or overly enthusiastic. Yeah, it's just a programming language. Aren't all programming languages the same? They're like just different syntax. I couldn't disagree more. To me, the nature of the programming language is what ignites your imagination for how you can create programs, and just as important, how you feel about when you do create programs. And creating programs with Ruby just continues after what I've been doing it now for 12, 13 years. Just so happy. Before jumping on this call, I'm just programming a bunch of stuff for Basecamp in Ruby, and I wake up and I get into these flows where I just think like, holy shit, I am lucky. Like how many people get to do this stuff for work for 10 years plus and still loving it when they do it. That doesn't mean it's amazing and you love it every day. It just means that there's enough of this sensation that this programming stuff is just oftentimes the thing I would most want to do.
I hear in your voice a lot of gratitude and thankfulness for having this. And I've noticed a trend where the people who are happiest in life tend to express gratitude and feel grateful for what they have in life.
Absolutely. I'm incredibly grateful for the work that Matt's put in creating Ruby over 20 years ago. Like, it's just amazing in itself. Not just that it was created 20 years ago, but that he continues to do the development on it, and the entire ecosystem that's grown up around it, and just the commercial opportunities that I've had that allowed me to focus on programming Ruby, and allow me even today, after running a company like Basecamp for over a decade, to spend probably the majority of my time, if you look over a whole year, programming. That's wonderful.
So there's a topic that you've been passionate about historically, this concept of flow, the state of focus where a programmer can get into.
Yes.
So Ruby obviously gets you into a state of flow. Are there other APIs or technologies that you love using every day that help you get into that flow state?
I think you're exactly right. Like, that is why Ruby is so amazing. It's the easiest access to flow that I have in front of a computer. Like, sitting down to program something in Ruby, usually using Rails, it's just like this door, and it's just right there, and you can open it, and like most of the time when you open it, there's flow. There's flow right there. Flow is probably the single most important thing to human happiness.
What is flow, by the way, for the audience?
Sure. So flow is this concept of being so engrossed in a task that you don't think of anything else. Like, you're completely absorbed by the task. Sometimes you lose a little bit track of time. You think, oh, I've been working on this for 10 minutes. No, you've been working on it for an hour and a half, or whatever, right? This immersion into the intellectual pursuit of making something. And it just, this notion of constantly learning, which is still true for me. I've been doing Ruby, as I said, for 13 years or something, and I learn something every day. I learn little nuances of how I want to express things. I tweak my technique, and Ruby is just so adaptable and deep too, to allow that. I think that's another aspect of Ruby as a programming language that's often underappreciated. A lot of programmers have a natural affection for simplicity. Like, let's boil everything down to sort of the fewest number of moving parts. And Ruby is the opposite in many ways. It's an incredibly complicated language in many of the same ways that natural languages are very complicated. And that is part of the beauty, that they have an expressiveness where it's not like doublespeak, the 1984 notion of boiling down language to just a few mechanical keywords that can express everything you want to say in a utilitarian way. Ruby is so much more subtle, which some people don't like, right? Like, this is a dividing point between programmers, that Ruby has subtleness to it, and it has many ways of doing the same things, where if you just look at it from the sort of cursory overview, it looks like, aren't these exactly the same thing? No, they're not. They're subtly different, and that version of saying the same thing fits perfect for that content, and perfect within these marginal differences, right? Like, you're skating at the last 1%, of the last 2% of awesomeness. And I think once you get that, as in with anything, the curve of cost for that goes way up, right? Like, Ruby is, as I said, a very complicated language to implement. I think it's an easy language to get into, and it's then a hard language to fully grasp and understand in depth, which is why it's still so appealing after 12 years, that you can keep peeling the onion and keep finding amazing new things and amazing discoveries, while at the same time also be able to, as a newcomer, jump into Ruby and, like, within a few weeks be amazingly productive. That was my conversion story, right? Like, when I originally wanted to try Ruby for creating Basecamp, I said, well, I'm gonna give it like 2 months. And it was about week 3 when I was like, holy shit, Ruby is on a different level. Like, I'm not going to be programming in other languages for the foreseeable future because this is it. So the conversion process was very short, while at the same time also having that depth that can provoke and induce flow after 12 years.
That's great. And you know, one of the things you touched on there was you mentioned the word craftsmanship. And I'm a big fan of craftsmanship and software craftsmanship. In fact, the Hack Pledge initiative is all about helping each other become better craftspeople in software development. So we had a speaker yesterday, Uncle Bob Martin, who helped create this mini movement in software craftsmanship. And Bob's theory is that we may have lost our way a little bit along the way, since agile principles were originally envisioned and originally encompassed a lot of craftsmanship principles. So what do you think about this? Do you think that developers have kind of lost their way a little bit in terms of crafting high quality code? Do you think there's a problem in professionalism right now in software development?
It's funny because I actually find a tension between those two words, craftsmanship and professionalism. Because professionalism to me stems more from the line of engineering, software engineering, computer science. And that line of the industry I'm not as interested in. That's not the part that really gets me fired up. That's not where I find flow. Where I find flow is on the craftsmanship side of things, but from a perspective of writing, software writing, as in clear, concise, expressive, interesting, even funny, novel writing. That all those aspects and descriptors of good writing, that's the part that fires me up about code. So I don't know, like, I often have a hard time when people make these proclamation about software quality. It always feels like back in my day, we were walking downhill one way or uphill one way and uphill back home again. And the wind was in our face and it was oh so hard and we didn't have any boots, and oh, you kids nowadays should be oh so happy for what you have and you don't appreciate what you have and blah, 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 blah. In many ways, I actually see it as a bit of a way of inflating your own self-ego. Like, we of an earlier generation were so much more careful and thoughtful about it. Which is another way of saying that, hey, beginners, people who don't come from the traditional computer science lineage of programmers are polluting our industry. Like, they're dragging it down, they're making it worse. Which is funny because I find echoes of that from when I did PHP programming. And this was back in the early 2000s, and PHP we had the same arguments, right? And usually it was from the more engineering-based languages, right? Like the Java programmers would snicker and sneeze at these PHP hackers that would just be smashing, copy-pasting things together, right? And I find that to be such a, first of all, which might be ironic coming from me, but arrogant perception and description of what programming is, and a very narrow one too. I think it's amazing that programming is now open to so many more people than this tiny clique that were able to do it back in the day. And that lots of software doesn't need to be rocket ship or pacemaker quality. That a range of criticality, the continuum is extremely broad. And lots of software is incredibly valuable, even though it's totally shitty. Right? Like, that's the weird dichotomy here, is that lots of people who are barely programmers or just getting into programming can create amazing value by making like barely functional software. Because software is just such a productivity boost in many areas and problem spaces that you don't even need that good software to make something amazing happen. It's kind of like the joke of pizza, right? Like, even cold shitty pizza is still pretty good pizza. And even shitty cold programming is, in a lot of cases, pretty good programming. Now, there are certainly cases where it's not true, right? Like, if you're like making the pacemaker, like, you need to apply a different level of, there I will actually use the word professionalism and engineering to the problem. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I just read this report on the, is it the F-35 fighter jet in the American military, and how the list of issues and bugs and integration problems that shit has. Now, I can guarantee you that the people who worked on that were considering themselves professionals. This is a software system of the highest criticality. And yet it is not above the fact that it is still software, and software is still broken in all sorts of ways. I find it less interesting to focus on that in all the ways that it's broken. Like the software that I work on at Basecamp every day, we have, I'm sure if someone did an exhaustive QA audit of it, actually they don't even have to do that. Now that I'm thinking through the to-do list that we have hundreds of open bugs. Like, so you could use that as a description to say, Basecamp is shitty software, right? Like it has hundreds of open bugs. Who would do that? Look at the iOS radar or anything else from it for any major piece of software, and you will see hundreds of open issues. This is the nature of software. It's always been the nature of software. This is what we do. This is how we work. So this fatalism that, oh shit, it's getting so much worse, and oh, it's all so terrible, or the quip of like, blah, blah, blah is broken. This is normal. I just find so uninteresting, unappealing, uninspiring, when what we should be looking at is the broader picture of like, what is the value software is bringing to the table here? And the value is fucking amazing.
So touching on that subject, let's talk about the idea of software testing and the quality of software as tested through test-driven development. So it's been a couple of years since you spoke at RailsConf on TDD, and you posted a blog post on the subject. And I'd love to chat with that a little bit as a post-mortem.
Yep.
So it was interesting. We actually had Kent Beck on camera yesterday, and you know, Kent, you know, as having one of the original champions of TDD, he actually had joined Facebook recently, and he mentioned that his view of TDD has actually changed quite a bit since he joined Facebook. At first, he noticed it was kind of an animal house there, but rather than trying to change Facebook and the way they developed, he decided to learn from how they were developing at Facebook. And what he found was that TDD wasn't always necessary as a cost-effective way to gather user feedback on potential new features. And they rely on monitoring and alerts and the ability to easily revert code so that they can remain agile. So he's kind of taking more of a middle ground approach towards, you know, he's advocating now that TDD shouldn't necessarily always be used, but should be used when appropriate. So what's your perspective on TDD these days?
Sure. I think that is a very sensible position to have that matches very much my own now. And that description of how Kent now views things was very much what led me to the blog post and the conference talk of saying, hey, a lot of the lore and mythology around TDD is overblown. It does not match reality, and the sooner we recognize that and reconcile it, the better off we are, and the sooner we can move forward with better practices that don't make programmers feel shitty about things that everyone does, and feel shitty about things that aren't contributing value. So, for example, at Basecamp, I think we have a code to test ratio of 0.5. I remember not too long ago, people bragging about, oh, my code to test ratio is 1.4, mine is 1.5, minus 1, or 1 to 4, 1 to 5, as though these were descriptions of value. Like, is your software more valuable just because it's more tested? Absolutely not. It may have lower defects, but I think that that's even a strenuous connection. I've seen a lot of heavily TDD'd code where you just go like, yeah, this is testing something. It's not testing whether this app actually does what it's supposed to do. Or it's testing framework features, so it's testing all sorts of stupid shit that people do with TDD and this notion of getting 100% coverage and so forth. So TDD to me remains at time, and by TDD I mean testing first, test driven, as in write the tests first, see them fail, then write some code, then see them pass, right? That loop. A lot of people take TDD to basically just mean, are you testing your code? I think that's an overly broad and not useful definition of TDD, because it sort of washes out what TDD actually is. TDD is a very specific feedback cycle and work method. And that work method I find to be a minority use case in the work that I do. A minority amount of the time, actually even a small minority of the time, is that the workflow that I have. That I first write a failing test, then I write a little bit of code to make that test pass, then I write another test, and so on and so forth, right? That flow is not that often how I do things. And certain styles and areas of code, I find it actually to be harmful. Like, I'll give you one example. So just yesterday, I was working on a feature in Basecamp 3 for a daily recap, where it recaps like all the things that changed in your Basecamps yesterday. Now, this is actually a fairly complicated piece of reporting. Like it has to dive into a bunch of different projects. It has to aggregate things in certain ways and present them in certain ways. You could totally have TDD that first, and it would totally have been a complete fucking waste of time. You know how I was testing it? I had like a fairly exhaustive list of seed data lined up, basic test data. And you know what I was doing? I was reloading my browser. I was making one change and reloading my browser. Does the report now look like what it's supposed to look like? Oh no, it doesn't. Let me make another change, load it again. Let me make another change, load it again. Which is, I mean, I don't fully remember, but I vaguely remember that Kent had this description of, hey, that's kind of TDD. And if that's the definition of TDD that we're using, that like I have something that I see, I get feedback on it, I make a change to the code, I get another piece of feedback, yeah, that's what I do. But for most people, most programmers I've heard of strong TDD proponents, like they go like, that's horrible. Because it's not reproducible, which is also true, right? Like it's not automated. Like I'm a manual component of that feedback flow. So it doesn't give me a regression suite, and it doesn't give me a bunch of other things like that. And in a lot of cases, that's totally fine. Like it is not worth it for me to spend the time to build a regression suite for this recap feature when I get the majority of the value through that feedback loop. The other aspect you're mentioning, which is like, hey, let's just roll out some code and see if it breaks. We use that too. So this notion of rolling specific features or changes to your software that are partially tested to some percentage of your user base and seeing if it fails, that's how we roll out new versions of using Rails, actually. So when we're upgrading a version of Rails, which right now is happening a lot, we're getting ready to launch Rails 5, and Basecamp 3 is basically tracking Rails master as close as it can, right? So let's say 2 weeks goes by and we bump the version of Rails that we're tracking. There's a bunch of changes, yes. One answer is if you had 100% test coverage of your entire app, you could just run your automated testing and you could be 100% confident that the shit still worked after you upgraded. Well, no one has that. And I don't think that's a worthy goal to have anyway, right? So we have a partial coverage of the app, and we will run that first and like, all right, it's not broken. Then we'll run some other tests, perhaps locally, and see, oh, it's not broken. Now I have, let's say I have 80% confidence that the upgrade that I made was good, it didn't introduce any regressions. The last 20%, if I had to find those on my own, that's a lot of expensive work to do. You know what's cheaper? Just roll out the shit, let the real users test it, 1% perhaps of Basecamp users, and if they trigger exceptions or find bugs, we fix them. And I can see the horror on someone's face who characterize themselves as a professional. That, what are you doing? Like you're pushing this out to customers, customers are fixing it, and what if they find a bug? Yeah, what if they find a bug? Like the world does not end. Like it's more important for the majority of customers that we actually make progress in good, sustained way and introduce new features and so on and so forth, rather than we ship 100% certified working software, which, I mean, is a misnomer and a fucking mirage anyway, which comes back to this criticality continuum. We are not shipping pacemaker software. And the more accurate you can nail your criticality, the faster you can move.
Now, what if you are shipping software that's a little bit more serious? Like, let's say you're a financial institution, a bank, you have cardholder data, maybe you're a healthcare company that has HIPAA compliant requirements. Do you think that TDD might be more appropriate in those kind of non-consumer? I mean, you could look at Facebook, for example. You know, Facebook it's a consumer site, so they can test 0.01% of their audience, and there's not going to be a big impact. But maybe for some other companies, there might be a big impact.
You should always gauge the specific criticality. Like if you're a bank and you're tinkering with the code that deducts money from one account and deposits it in another account, yeah, that's probably a high criticality piece of code. But you'd probably be surprised if you talk to banking developers how often that shit does not work in real banks, how often they actually have to fix things. Like, I think there's a lot of mythology about like, oh, well, banks and financial institutions and healthcare companies, like they are these paragons of software and they do this with high degrees of professionalism. And then you talk to people who actually work there and you go like, holy shit, how does this even work? How does the banking system not collapse on a daily basis, right? Anyway, I mean, at least from a theoretical perspective, yes, assess the criticality, but it's not like there's an industry level criticality. Much of what happens on your online banking side is not at all at that level of criticality. Like, a lot of it is for summarizing like your spending habits, like what falls into the category of travel and what falls into the category of entertainment or stuff like that. It has much more the same criticality as a base camp or something else, like information display. Yeah, I think it's funny. It's either banking or it's health or it's the paper dragon that usually gets brought up too is flight control systems. What if you worked on flight control? Yeah, okay. What if you worked on that? How many of people in the audience here work on flight control systems?
We can actually poll the audience to find out.
We should poll the audience. I would be very curious if we even have one person.
How should I phrase the poll
on flight control systems?
Do you work on a flight control system? Is that how you want to ask it? I think we know what the answer to that's going to be.
Right.
Maybe a more broad question might be, yes, do you work on mission critical applications that have serious impact if TDD isn't used, perhaps?
No, that's way too self-indulgent. Like, people who are proponents of TDD will say that what they work on is critically important because that's how you justify
what's an unbiased way we can ask this question?
Which I think you have to ask about facts, not opinions. So a fact is, do you work on either pacemakers, flight control systems, or actual rocket launchers? Like, do you work at SpaceX or something else like that? So if you work on one of these things, fine. You get to have a separate discussion of criticality from the general discussion of criticality that we have when we talk about information systems.
All right, I'm going to ask that exactly as you said, but I'm going to add a potential answer, which is yes, no, and then the third answer is I hope to someday.
Like, I'll answer right now, I do not hope to someday. I would not want to work on that level of criticality. Holy shit. Like, let the real engineers do that shit. And then the people like me who care about writing and expressiveness and rolling things out to users and see if it breaks, they can continue to work on the web information systems.
So this is the magic of the virtual conference, is that we already have the statistics that have come in. That's how fast it takes. So we can iterate on our conversation.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Are you seeing the results in real time?
Yeah, I'm seeing it. So there's actually 10 people in the audience that work on flight control systems, pacemakers, or actual rocket launchers. That's awesome.
So do you believe that? Do you think that they're actually there, or is that a joke?
No, I think 90% of that is a joke. But regardless, obviously some people somewhere do work on those things. But I think that is a great case of where just because you need a certain set of software development principles when you work on these extreme high criticality systems where the consequences of an error is death, or loss of hundreds of millions, do not apply these principles to general programming. That is the worst thing you can do, which is I think I often harp on that. If you're a, let's say, 5-person company or 10-person company, listening to how a 100,000-person company operates is often the 180-degree opposite of how you should be operating. The things that a 100,000-person company does and need to do, and the procedures and blah, blah, blah that they need to have to operate that behemoth, they're in direct opposition to what's in your best interest as a small company. So that's why we need to segregate advice a lot more around context. Obviously, I mean, that's what the pattern movement was around or about for a long time, that like you have to describe the context first, right? Before you can describe how you're solving a problem, because very few prescriptions are generally applicable. But I do think that there are buckets of use, as in more people, if you take the audience here, will work on will work on systems where the criticality is not death, where a mistake or a bug does not lead to death, right? Thus, they can kind of disregard a lot of the principles that need to be applied when the criticality is death. Like, that's not what they should be thinking about. They should be thinking about things like, how can I create the most amount of value? How can I have sustainable high productivity and introduce things and make users happy and all these other things, right? And that's a different category of concerns than the concern of, I make a mistake, people die.
So I did another poll while you were speaking.
Yes.
So there was a poll earlier, which is, have you used TDD at work? Have you ever used it?
Right.
44% said yes, 56% no. And then I thought, I wonder if that's real TDD or not. And so then I asked a similar question that's not exactly the same, which is, do you write your tests before you write your code?
Yes.
20% yes, 80% no. Interesting, huh?
Exactly. And that comes to the point of, like, a lot of the feedback I got on, like, TDD is dead. People did not, we did not agree on what TDD is. Even though I think it's pretty obvious, I thought that TDD was pretty well described. Kent certainly makes no bones about how you're describing the workflow of what TDD is, like red-green refactor and so forth. It's a very specific workflow. But for a lot of people, TDD has come to mean just testing. Oh, I test my code, which is such an overly broad category of work that it's useful or useless to really talk about in these terms. TDD, and whether you do practice TDD, is a useful descriptor when we agree on what TDD is. It's red, green, refactor. It's write your test first, write some code, make it pass, refactor. And TDD then is also then driving your design from those things, right? You're driving your design from writing the test first, and you're letting the design of your system be driven by the needs of the test. And that was really what got me fired up, because I saw a lot of code being damaged and hurt by the concerns of the tests that were not the same concerns as the concerns of the use. That there are certain concerns about how you test things in isolation that lead you down paths of design that you would not have traveled if those were not your concerns. And that's where I really get fired up, and I say, like, hey, do we have the cart driving the horse here, or whatever that saying is, that you shouldn't have tests driving your design. What the hell are you doing? You should have your app driving your design. Anyway, that was some of the dividing lines in that debate, and we explored that in depth with Kent and Martin Fowler on a series of webcasts. I think we did like 4 or 5 of them. So anyone who's interested in more rigor on that should go look those up.
Very good. Okay, so let's move on to our next subject, and then we'll take some audience questions. So let's talk about Ruby on Rails. So you released it roughly 10 years ago, give or take a few months. How far along has Rails come in the last decade, and where do you think Rails is headed in the future? What's on the horizon for Rails going forward?
Sure. So we're just on the cusp of releasing Ruby on Rails 5, which is a major new release that I'm super excited about, because I've been working on it for the last 18 months in conjunction with my work on Basecamp 3. And Basecamp 3 really got to drive a lot of those design decisions, as every version of Basecamp has ever done for Ruby on Rails. And the extractions we've been able to put into Rails 5 are just awesome. Like, they really bring a smile to my face. And the chief amongst those extractions is a brand new framework called Action Cable, which gives Rails an integrated way of dealing with real time over WebSockets. So anytime your application needs real-time updates, Rails now has a specific framework for dealing with that called Action Cable that wraps WebSockets and the way you deal with WebSockets in a really appealing conceptual model that is very close to the conceptual model that you've been using for the rest of your application. Not only is the conceptual model close, it's an integrated part. So up until this point, a lot of people who've been doing Ruby on Rails, if they wanted to do WebSocket stuff, they kind of did it on the side, perhaps as a separate app, or perhaps an entirely separate system, not even connected to Ruby and to their Rails stuff. And I thought, like, that's a shame. Like, you don't get to build on the integrated system that you already have. You don't get to build on the models that you already have. All of a sudden, you're reduced to building another add-on to a distributed system, which distributed systems is pet peeve of mine. Do not distribute your systems if you do not have to distribute your systems. Or what is it? The first law of distributed systems is don't. I'm a big believer in that. I'm a big believer in distributing your systems is a terrible idea unless you absolutely positively must, which there are several cases where you absolutely positively must. But anyway, Action Cable basically gets WebSockets connected straight to the rest of your Rails application. It is no harder or different to connect WebSockets now and real-time features in your app as it is to build another mailer that sends out emails, or build jobs, asynchronous background jobs that we added in Rails 4.2 with Active Job. And the framework is just a peach. I really like using it. I really love working with it. And that's probably the star feature. But I mean, we've added a ton of stuff. Another push, which is kind of adjacent but connected, is the push for TurboLinks 5. So TurboLinks has been this controversial framework for a while now in the Rails and broader communities, where it's a repudiation of client-side MVC for the majority case. Basically saying that this rush for single-page applications that came when people realized that making single-page application could provide some really tangible user benefits in responsive and fast applications. Problem was that getting to that often required, or traditionally went through the path of client-side MVC. So again, this is back to this distributed system where you build another application on the front end that now talks to your back-end application over JSON or whatever, right? And you disconnect those two things from each other. I found the development experience of working with that, and we tried in a variety of different ways for Basecamp to do this, to be terrible. And when I say terrible, I mean terrible for the kind of work that we had to do most of the time. Not terrible for all work at all times, terrible for the majority of work that we had to do most of the time. So an app like Basecamp, 95 or higher % of the application, in my opinion, is a poor fit for client-side MVC. That client-side MVC drastically overcomplicates the work that should be so much simpler. But you want some of the benefits, right? Like you want some of the benefits of a fast, responsive app where a user clicks a link and 150 milliseconds later, they're on the next page in such a way that it feels super native fast, right? TurboLinks is basically a way of getting those benefits without giving up the simplicity of the request response model that web frameworks have been built on for a decade, right? That instead of going distributed system, instead of going client-side MVC and serializing everything to JSON and shuttling it back and forth, we can pretend it's 2004. And we have the beautiful simplicity of generating a full HTML document on the server side and sending it to the client, along with all the benefits of the speed and the responsiveness of the client-side apps. So TurboLinks 5 basically takes that idea and puts it even further on steroids and expands dramatically the scope of where we want to bring this improvement, primarily to native applications. Lots of apps have found that productivity can hit a wall once the native question comes up. Once you have to build native apps and native screens for everything in those apps, productivity grinds to a halt, or you need to bulk up your team dramatically, because working in a native environment just is inherently slower than generating an HTML page. And the whole development cycle is just, in my opinion, atrociously bad compared to developing an HTML page. Now, sometimes you have to do it, right? Again, the same thing as with client-side MVC. Sometimes the benefits are so large that you're willing to suffer the indignity of writing that Java code because you need to create a native Android application, right? You should just have to do it. There's no way around it. Or the ways that are around it are even more painful than just going through that initial first painful path. But TurboLinks basically says, let's try to reduce that amount of pain for as much as possible, such that we can create very compelling, user-happy applications where the bulk of the app is not native, does not require every screen to be native, but is served by this majestic monolith, the integrated system, your one app that spits things out, and then you have a TurboLinks wrapper that consumes it. So we're just on the cusp of releasing that as well. TurboLinks 5, we just pushed out the new documentation for that today. And next week, we will have the wrappers for iOS and for Android, which basically gives you a whole solution for developing a new app in the vein of a Basecamp or GitHub or whatever that also includes native apps, which is such a huge jump forward, such a massive level up of the productivity that you can have as a developer and as a small team, that I'm just super excited about that. Like, I'm super excited about sharing that. Again, it feels like we have a secret, that like we've stumbled into this treasure trove of productivity that is not widely distributed, and that a lot of people for a lot of the times are doing things way, way harder than they need to be. So that was the original appeal and rush of releasing Ruby on Rails as well. And I'm getting much of the same tingling as I was with the original release of Ruby on Rails, where I just felt like, oh, holy shit, I have an answer here that's not part of the general discussion. And that answer is good. And it is my duty as a developer to share that answer. Like, why should we sit on these amazing spoils all by ourselves? Why should we keep this stuff to ourselves? Like, we have the power to save teams from so much tedious, needless work and enable them to do so much bigger and better things. I mean, isn't that the reason we're all involved with open source in the first place? Like, to share those secrets and to share those techniques. So this feels like a major, major wave of that.
So in the last 15 minutes here, I just want to, before we go to the audience questions, ask one more touch point on Rails in the future. So I've noticed in San Francisco, there's been a lot of excitement recently about the Go programming language. And a lot of developers kind of looking to that and actually kind of falling in love with that in terms of the beauty of that language. And then there's another camp of developers who are looking at Node.js. And I think there's not a whole lot of disagreement out there that JavaScript is an ugly language, and and that there's a lot of syntactical and other structural changes that would be necessary for JavaScript to really be on the same level as Ruby. And I personally do not like programming in JavaScript. I kind of have to, just to get by on the client. But sometimes from a realistic perspective, I look at the world and I say, well, there's all these JavaScript front-end developers who can now leverage that skill set to start programming on the server side from a political perspective. So how do you see Go and Node.js fitting in with the Ruby on Rails ecosystem going forward? What are your predictions going forward on that?
Yeah, so first, Go. Go is a good example. We've adopted Go a fair bit, especially in our operations department, the sysadmins. And I think that Go is great at these small, targeted things that need to be really fast. The things where you would, in the past, perhaps have dug down and said, oh, shit, let's write like a C program. Oh, shit, let's write a C++ program. Oh, shit, let's even write a Java program, just because we can get down to some primitives and we can get a speed that we really need. But I've also looked enough at Go and played around with it that it's completely inconceivable to me to build a Basecamp in that. Never gonna happen. Well, I shouldn't say it couldn't happen. There are lots of masochists out there. So maybe someone would try to do that. I think that would be a terrible, terrible idea. It is way too close to the metal. Like, it's a better wrapping around the metal than a lot of other wrappings around the metal, but it's still a very hostile environment for programmers who like programming as writing and want to build apps like Basecamp. Like, I don't think at all it's compatible with that. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be used for sort of small target things that then output some JSON, and then it's part of a larger web application. But trying to build a whole app like Basecamp in it, just shoot me now. So I get the excitement though. I get the excitement. Like, we need something that's close to the metal, and it doesn't have to hurt as much as C hurts, right? Like, why should it? Like, why can't we make leaps like that? So I think Go is awesome for that. And I could totally see using it for those small targeted cases. And for some people, obviously, they're not small, they're much larger. I'm just describing my category of work, which is working on applications like Basecamp, it's unlikely to play a larger role in composing that stuff. Now, Node.js is a little bit different. I think you're absolutely right, is that there's a lot of people who do know JavaScript already, so the jump from JavaScript to Node.js is a small one, and there's an inherent attraction in the one language paradigm. Oh, I'm just using the same language on the client side as I am on the server side, isomorphic, that's a holy grail for some people. For me, of very little appeal. Like, I am not a one paradigm programmer. I very much appreciate that Ruby on Rails as an ecosystem is a mosaic, and we match these things together in a quilt and take the best things and the best ideas from all over, the best paradigms of all sorts, and mix them together. So the fact that I have to context switch between Ruby for some code and JavaScript for another code, I see as a benefit, not a detraction. Now, on top of that, I've looked at enough Node.js too to render the opinion that the bulk of the code that I've seen, again, if you're trying to build an app like Basecamp, which is a stand-in basically for these kind of like high screen count, I don't know, complex is a wrong word. It's easier to describe by example, like the Basecamps, the GitHubs, the Airbnbs, like all of these sort of apps in this vein, apps that are not, let's say, like a game or a single page application in the sense that it has a single screen where you have some interaction with. Those kinds of apps, when I've seen them done in Node.js and with Express and so on, I go like, again, shoot me now. Like, this seems like a huge regression over where we are with Ruby on Rails. Again, there is room and should be, and that is the value of the web, that we can have different opinions on this. That some people can totally say like, hey, I love Node.js. Like, JavaScript is the best thing ever, and this is amazing to work with, and it makes me happy. I can applaud that and say, that is great. And isn't it wonderful that I don't have to use that shit? Like, isn't it great that we can coexist, and you can build your web app in Node.js, and you can build yours in Go, and I can build mine in Ruby. Like, holy crap, the web is awesome. Because contrast this to the native environment experience, right? Well, if you're building an iOS app and you're not using Swift and Objective-C, well, good luck to you. We tried with Ruby Motion and so on, and I think those are valiant efforts, but they're extremely marginal. Like, it's the domination of Swift and Objective-C in iOS development is probably like 99.9%, right? Maybe that's not entirely fair. There's a fair number of apps that then share like a backend of some kind behind other systems. But the vast majority is done in the platform-sanctioned languages. The web does not have a sanctioned platform when it comes to the back end. It has a sanctioned platform when it comes to the front end, and you do have to use JavaScript for that. And I think that's in part a travesty, but we've been making improvements on that, and at least we can use preprocessors such that I never write JavaScript, I write CoffeeScript. I think CoffeeScript is actually a very nice language in many ways, and it turns JavaScript into something that's far, far closer to the experience I have with Ruby. Still, far rather be writing Ruby, but if I have to be writing JavaScript and I can do it through CoffeeScript, it's not that bad. In fact, I can have fun with that. What was I going to say? So the web does not have this dominant platform. Like, if you look at a breakdown of the ecosystems that power the web, they're incredibly diverse. You do not have any one development platform that dominates like 90% of it, or 95% as you have in native environments, right? So that's awesome. That's really good. And it's really good that we have this diversity, and we should have this diversity. And sometimes to make big leaps forward, you have to take a few steps backwards. So maybe at some point, either of these other platforms will emerge into something where I would look at it again and go like, oh yeah, awesome. Like, now it's really cool, and I'd use that for something. We're not there at that point. But again, I'm not exactly an unbiased observer here, right? Like, it's like asking the owner of Coca-Cola, so what do you think about soft drinks right now? Like, what's cool? Like, do you think Pepsi got some new cool stuff? Like, obviously I'm gonna be biased, right? Like, I've fallen head over heels in love with Ruby, and I've proclaimed that love. Like, I do not proclaim to be an unbiased, objective observer of programming languages. Like, I have voted with my feet, and so apply truckloads of salt to that. I mean, I think the larger point is no developer is objective, even though developers in the scientific sense love to proclaim and pretend that they are. But I've never seen a discussion of programming languages on any major internet forum where I'd go, oh yeah, that's a group of independent-minded, objective, unbiased observers. Yeah, right.
So let's go to some audience questions here. The first question, the future of Rails. I think we kind of already touched on that. You talked about what's coming. Let's talk about the next question. Why is Ruby on Rails dying?
It dovetails well from the discussion we just had, right? Like, no observer of programming languages who are a programmer are unbiased. Now, let's take that, unpack that question. What does dying mean? I think what it means to a lot of people is that the hype is not at the fever pitch it was when something was new. This is the nature of technology. When technology is new and introduced, a lot of people talk about it a lot. When technology has been around for 13 years, not as many people talk about it in the same continuous, heated debates because the thing is known. Like, Ruby on Rails is not novel anymore, right? Most people who've worked with programming have established opinions about what it is. They're not trying to find out in the same ways that they were in the early days, right? So the natural level of energy on like, hey, what is this thing? What can I use it for? Can I use it for this thing? Can I use it? No, you can't use it for that. Like, that level of energy disappears because the unknown is replaced by the known. And that is the evolution that every single ecosystem goes through. No ecosystem escapes this. I just saw a report the other day saying Java, I think on GitHub, is still the most popular language. Like, I never hear of Java anymore. Like, the only stuff I hear about Java these days is like, oh, again, I mean, I'm also a little bit in my cocoon, but in the general sense of Java, it does not have a lot of energy, right? It's still incredibly used because that's just how it is. Like,
I think it's
Java,
actually I think it's the #1 job on Indeed.com for search.
There you go, right? There you go. Fucking Java is the #1 job on Indeed. So very widely used, deeply ingrained, lots of opportunity, lots of people doing stuff in that community, no excitement. Right? I mean, obviously excitement within that, but from the broader programming community that's not part of that, it's not a thing we talk about anymore. Like, I used to talk about Java a lot because it was like this, it had this main energy back in the early 2000s where this was the main thing you were up against. It's kind of the same thing as with Microsoft, right? Like, Microsoft continues to be an amazing business in the amount of money it throws up. I mean, perhaps a little less now, but if you look back 5 years, it was still an amazing business that threw a lot of stuff off, and nobody talked about them anymore. They weren't setting the agenda in any meaningful sense of the word for a broader context.
And David, I think that the excitement actually has a very interesting psychological impact on the world, because what I've noticed is that companies will put job descriptions on their website saying, we're looking for a developer with a certain skill set. For example, we want someone with Node.js background, Ruby on Rails background.
Yep.
And then developers see those job postings and they say, okay, well, I need to learn that latest stuff. I need to make sure that I'm always on the cutting edge, always learning new languages and frameworks, or I'm not as employable. And then I see other companies who are language agnostic. When they hire engineers, they don't care what stack they're on. They just say, we just want to hire smart people, and you'll figure it out once you get here. And I think that it's the companies that are requiring certain languages, and I think they do have a case for that sometimes, that then pushes developers to think, I need to make sure I'm staying current. And I want to prefer to work at a job where I can learn something new from a stack perspective.
Yes.
What do you think?
I think you're being slightly charitable to how objective and reasonable and fact-driven this process is. I don't think it is as much. I think it's far more driven by the emotions. And the emotions simply are that new things are new and new things are exciting. So when something new comes out that has interesting and good properties, which Node.js totally had, like, it's not like there's nothing interesting there. There's lots of interesting things there. I can totally appreciate why people think, oh, hey, this is cool. Let's check this out. And then it gets to have this moment of being the new thing, which is wonderful. Ruby on Rails enjoyed that immensely. We were the new thing for a long time. And then now we're not the new thing anymore. Now we're the established thing. right? Like if you're a rebel and you win, you turn into the establishment. Like that's basically how it works. Ruby started out as a rebel and we won. So winning in many definitions is just, you turn boring, like you turn safe, you turn something that a bank can use, right?
Do you like being the establishment, or do you like being the rebel? I
like being the rebel, but I like even more working on things that I care about. So the rebel, being a rebel part, like is something I do enjoy, but it's a side effect of something else, which is working on things I really care about and I'm passionate about, and never been more passionate or interested or happy working with Ruby on Rails as a platform. And what I'm extra happy about is that we've reached a point in the ecosystem's life cycle where Ruby on Rails is going to live forever. Like in 50 years from now, there's going to be Ruby on Rails applications running, just like there are Cobalt applications still running and all sorts of other very old systems running, right? So whether or not Ruby on Rails is even a thing in 50 years, like there will still be systems running on it. And that is a milestone to reach as a community that's pretty amazing. So there you go.
Great. Let's take one more question from the audience. If you were a senior developer in another company that used the X technology for development of the X product, how would you convince them to use Ruby on Rails, and why?
So how do you convince anyone to use Ruby on Rails? It depends on who you're trying to convince. If you're trying to convince programmers, I don't think arguments work, because these things are emotional. However much programmers dress them up as though, again, they're these objective people who just look at the facts and compare the tools and use the best tools for the job, bullshit. They are biased people who are invested in things that they already know and compare things to the paradigms that they're already comfortable with. So you can list off features, benefits, who else is using it, and blah, 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 as much as you want. It's not going to work. What you need to do with someone who's a developer is you need to sit down with that person and show them, like, hey, see this problem we're hitting in our application right now? Let me show you how you would do that in Ruby on Rails. And can't do that just once, because you have to break down layers of ingrained defense mechanisms to get into the core where you actually have a chance of convincing someone, right? So that's the developer side. Like you have to show and tell. Well, you have to show, not tell. For the business side of things, like convincing a non-technical boss to allow you to use Ruby on Rails, I don't know if there's that much convincing of that going on anymore. That was more in the beginning when Ruby on Rails was the REPL. Lots of business people were like, hey, I don't want to use REPL technology. Use the fucking tried and true thing. Like, what's the big company selling? Use that. We don't have that as much anymore. So I think that's less of a case. But what I found is that going rogue is often the answer there. So if you're stuck in some environment that's just inherently unproductive, just spend some nights and weekends, build a sliver of the system in Ruby on Rails and show them to management and say, like, hey, look what I just built in like a third of the time or fourth of the time.
It's that old mantra that code wins all arguments.
Yep. I think so. I mean, actually, in both instances. In the one instance, it's code of like someone experiencing it, and the other end, it's code in terms of a running application. That's something everyone can understand and be convinced by. Again, arguments, no.
So I want to touch on one final piece of wisdom from you to, just kind of general human interest wisdom here. So you wrote a very interesting blog post recently, which is called "Try Harder to Be Someone Else." And I'd love for the audience to learn a little bit more about what you meant by that. And then also, who do you look to be harder to be more like?
Yeah, so try harder to be someone was a reaction to the saying, oh, just be yourself. Everything's going to be great. Just be yourself. And I went like, fuck no, don't be yourself. Like, the version of yourself right now is a 1.0 at best. There's probably a shitty 1.0. And there's a 5.0 there that's less like your 1.0 and more like someone else's 5.0, right? So that then basically just led me to explore the ways that other people have influenced me in the ways where I distinctly said, like, I want to be more like that person. I want to be less like myself, as in what myself is right now, and more like that person as in that person is right now. And in the technical and writing communities. I've had plenty of opportunities to exercise that. One of the examples I gave in the talk is topical here is Kent Beck. I got to see Kent at a 2003 Java, funnily enough, conference in Denmark, on stage, talking about extreme programming. And I went like, holy shit, Kent got it down. Like, he is such a convincing speaker, and he's such a convincing thinker. I want to be more like Kent. Like, let me study Kent, figure out like what are the tools and the techniques and the methods that he uses to be so damn compelling and convincing. I'm going to adopt that. I'm going to be more like Kent and less like me in terms of trying to convince people things. Other examples of that is Gerald M. Weinberg, who's written, I don't know, 40, 50, 60 books at this point. Some of the best technical writing I've ever read. And by technical, I don't mean like, oh, here's a description of how this framework works, but technical in the sense of like, what is software quality? How do you define requirements? What is the psychology of a programmer? What is the secrets of consulting? All of these deeper questions. Not only were Gerald's or Jerry's thoughts on that incredible, his writing was just so immersive and what's the word I want to use? Not that fancy, like plain, right? And I thought like, wow, this is great. This is really good. So 2 examples in the technical space. In terms of talking about what it is we do and figuring it out in terms of product, Kathy Sierra has been a role model and someone I'd like to be more like for a long time. I first discovered her blog back in, I think, 2004 or 5, Creating Passionate Users. Absolutely amazing thinker and self-deprecating and goofy and still serious and just really impressive. That was another person I just picked out and said, oh, this is, I gotta be more like Kathy.
Great, thank you, David. We learned a lot from you today. I really appreciate you being here and taking a stand for coding nonprofits and educating our audience. So audience members, if you enjoyed David's message today, please consider making a donation. There's a widget in your user interface for you to make a donation right now. You'll be helping diversity initiatives across the world, transforming government initiatives, helping kids learn to code. You'll be making a difference in people's lives. And so please consider making a donation. And David, thank you for being here today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And by the way, David will be available for just a few minutes to take audience questions privately. I'm going to paste his Hangout link into the chat window. So talk to you soon.